What I'm going to talk about today is an idea that began about 5 years ago, but I haven't been able to talk about it mainly because it's been under a patent issue, but now that's been resolved. All right. So some ideas are the product of planning, iteration, and sometimes there's a little bit of genius out there. Other times it's just pure chance and desperation. So I'm going to talk about the latter, chance and desperation. All right, the chance was me meeting Alan Scott, a new dad like myself, on a dad's night out just because it was our night to go out. Now, what's interesting about that is that without that opportunity, I would have never met this person. Uh, the desperation that we talked about that night was just getting a good night's worth of sleep. And I'm sure that's true of many new parents out there, that we dreamed of getting at least 6 hours of solid sleep, and the only place that we could actually imagine us getting sleep was on the planet Mars. All right. So what began as a joke that night actually turned out to be a topic of discussion for the rest of the night because I was working on the geology of Mars, and Alan Scott was a civil engineer. Now, could we figure out a way to sleep on Mars? So I told Alan, like, the first thing that we have to deal with is the levels of radiation on Mars because they're detrimental to human health, all right? So even if we got there, the experts tell me that humans wouldn't survive that long. So we have to deal with that. You have to know that Mars is very different from Earth. It doesn't provide the protection from radiation that Earth does, all right? So we have to deal with this. So one approach of getting around this is to send sort of man-made capsules from Earth to Mars. But in order for them to provide adequate protection from the radiation, you need significant amounts of heavy metals, things like lead. Now, if you ever want to make a rocket scientist head explode, tell them that you want to send up one of the heaviest metals on our planet into outer space. So that's just simply not feasible. All right, so what happened was is that the rest of the night we had this discussion and we came to the conclusion that the only way that we could survive on Mars and get a good night's sleep was to use the resources on the planet's surface, right? It kind of makes sense. Use what you've got. So with Alan Scott being a civil engineer and a concrete specialist, he suggested fiberglass. No, he suggested concrete, okay? Just making sure you're paying attention there. I'm watching you. All right, so he suggested concrete, and I was like, all right, fair enough. He suggested concrete to make big, thick walls to sort of protect the shelters, concrete to line the tunnels, concrete as far as the eye could see. It sounds like a great idea. However, the geology of Mars is not really good at producing concrete, or it's really hard to produce concrete given what we know about the geology of Mars. And the reason why that is that to make concrete, you need calcium carbonate. So those you in geology, what was calcium carbonate? Do you still remember that? CaCO3, good. They still remember something. All right, very good. All right, so you need calcium carbonate, and the way that we find calcium carbonate present in the rocks on Earth are present in rock form as this. This is limestone, and if you take this limestone and you heat it up and you put a little pressure on it, it turns into beautiful marble. I just took these two pictures. I was just in Vienna. I took these two pictures there, and it was just kind of neat to see those two together. All right, so what do we need calcium carbonate? Well, limestone and marble are sort of the end product of lots of living life forms giving their lives in hard bodies to produce this rock. And as far as we know today, on Mars, there is no evidence for life on this planet. So using things like limestone and marble is just not going to work. So if we're going to come up with some sort of scenario to create a new concrete, we essentially have to break away from a recipe that's been around since the ancient Roman times. All right, so one of the things that sort of was occurring around the same time is I was working on a project in which I saw some rocks gluing themselves back together at relatively low temperatures. And I thought to myself, wow, that's kind of interesting. Well, what's occurring here is there's a process referred to as serpentinization. All right, it's a big word, but all really serpentinization is you get some olivine, which is a silicate, you add a little bit of water, and that's it. All right, so it's a big word, but sort of just taking one of the most common minerals on our planet, putting it in water, seeing what happens, and using those products. All right, so could we use serpentinization and its processes, since we see it on Earth, and believe it or not, we see these processes happening on Mars as well, to make concrete? Could we use nature as a guide, which is telling us how to make these things and glue rocks back together to see if we can sort of reverse engineer that process? All right, so One of the essential ingredients that you need to make cement or concrete is CaO, calcium oxide, otherwise known as lime. And how you get calcium oxide is you heat up the limestone, you heat up the marble at relatively high temperatures to produce this stuff. Now, I knew nothing about lime at the time, but what I suggested to Alan, with my sheer stroke of sort of genius after a couple of years, was that rather than focusing on calcium, why not put in magnesium, based on serpentinization? Because we know the surface of Mars has a lot more magnesium than it does on Earth. So could we make this work? And magnesium could work. It's roughly the same size, same charge as calcium. Could we figure out how to take the products of serpentinization and do this? All right. So there's two ways we can do this. Two main minerals that serpentinization produces. One, you can produce a primary mineral called brucite, which is magnesium hydroxide, and magnesite was a magnesium carbonate. And you can see from these two minerals, they're not too far off from producing magnesium oxide. Not too far off. So what we decided to do is trying to figure out how we could use the process of serpentinization to produce magnesium oxide to see if that could be our new type of lime. All right. So another unconventional approach that we decided to do is we included pumice or volcanic glass within our cement to sort of supply a source of reactive silica. Now, this is unconventional. People just don't do this. But this type of glass is available on Mars. It's available on Earth. Could we do this? Could silica in the form of these volcanic glasses help us out? And the last thing that we needed to do, we needed to produce aggregate, because aggregate is an important component of concrete. So rather than just sort of scooping up some rocks around Earth, we decided, could we reproduce any sort of Martian regolith based on Martian Curiosity rover analysis? So we took all that, we mapped all of Mars, and we figured out a process not to make just a little bit of aggregate, but lots of aggregate for civil engineering purposes. All right, so that's it. Tried to figure out a way to produce magnesium oxide. We then took some volcanic glass, mixed in some Martian regolith as our aggregate, and some water. All right, so here we begin the montage. I'm not sure if you've ever seen Karate Kid. Have you seen Karate Kid? Where you get a little bit better as you go. So I always have this in mind, like, you're the best. We began many years in the making. This was our first attempt at making our magnesium-based concrete, and every time we learned something a little bit more. And it got better, and it got better, and eventually we came up with this. This concrete is a magnesium-based concrete, which is just as strong as Portland cement, the stuff you use to make buildings with. That's pretty cool. All right. Some of the problems with this right now is we're trying to increase our yield of magnesium oxide related to the brucite. We have to do all this within the energy constraints of Mars. We are trying to process all these samples with just using the power supplied by a solar panel, which is really different. And the other thing we have to worry about is liquid water on Mars. How do we get it, and how do we maintain it in liquid form? Now, serpentinization also provides another sort of unique thing. It produces H2. This is molecular hydrogen. This is the stuff that's used in fuel cells. This is also rocket fuel. All right, so for one process of making cement, we can also make a fuel for the Martians who are there, as well as to get them home. We thought that was pretty interesting. The only thing we have to worry about now is to sort of compress and store this material. And I'll tell you this, for us to get combustible levels of hydrogen, all we need is a little bit of olivine, liquid water, and it turns out in 24 hours at 50 degrees Celsius, we can get combustible levels of hydrogen. That's pretty fast. All right, so what we've been able to do, and what took us a long time to figure out, is we were able to make concrete and cement on Mars using the constraints of the things on Mars. And we could also figure out a way to produce the fuel for the Martians, as well as the fuel to get the Martians back home to Earth. We thought that was really interesting. So only in the end, when Al and I looked at each other as far as constraining ourselves with regards to Martian geology, constraining ourselves with regards to the amount of energy that we have there, there's a lot of constraints that you do there, but it pressed us in such a way that we had to really think outside the box to go around some of these problems. And in doing that, we came up with a way to not only help the Martians, but to help the Earthlings. You see, it turns out the cement industry and cement production releases CO2. CO2 is a greenhouse gas, All right, you're following me so far? It turns out that the cement industry supplies about 10% of the non-anthropogenic CO2 to the atmosphere. Cement production is a huge contributor to global climate change and global warming. What we were able to do is we were able to figure out a method that reduces the energy, because we were constrained by solar panels for our energy, by nearly half of what cement production needs now. In the best case scenario, we figured out a way to eliminate CO2 release completely in making cement. And the ultimate case right now, what we're trying to do, is sort of the holy grail of CO2. We're taking CO2 from other sources and figuring out a way to put them back into solid form and sequester them to make this material a sink for CO2, thereby helping global climate change and global warming. So what happened in the end? Well, this is really simple. In our desperation of dads just trying to get a good night's sleep, we came up with a way for people to survive on Mars, as well as to produce energy on Mars. But more importantly, we came up with a way for us Earthlings to perhaps stay on Earth a little bit longer. Thank you.